You're asking good questions. They're hard.
Good.
The whole diaspora stuff. That's yeah. I mean, yeah, some of them are not going to like the answer, which is fine, but I think most people will.
There's been a lot of talk about lobbying lately. Former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy a few months ago mentioned that Azerbaijan has an exceptional, powerful lobby, while Armenia does not. My guest today is Timothy Jemal. He is the president of GlobalArm, a newly formed nonprofit organization focused on enhancing security and economic ties between the US and Armenia. A few months ago, GlobalArm hired two lobbying firms, McKeon Group and Plurus Strategies, to expand its DC advocacy. Tim, thank you for joining us today.
Sona, thank you for having me.
So first of all, you're an independent organization. You're not hired by the Armenian government, correct?
Correct. So we are an independent US-based nonprofit organization. We actually have two organizations. We've got Global Arm, which is the lobbying wing of the organization, and we have a connected organization called the Global Arm Foundation, which is designed to take educational delegations to Armenia, principally members of Congress, their staff, other elected officials, to actually see what's happening on the ground. And the organization, neither organization is aligned with, connected to, or supported by the government of Armenia or any political party in Armenia or in the United States. So we're completely independent of all political organizations and governments, both in Armenia and in the United States.
And so then what is the significance of hiring the two lobbying firms that I mentioned? And what are some of the accomplishments
So
to
it's
date?
very significant, and it's very recent. So I've been involved personally myself in doing both Armenian advocacy and lobbying domestically and internationally on other issues for close to 35 years.
Hmm.
And so when the Artsakh War of 2020 broke out, and Azerbaijan preemptively attacked Artsakh with backing from Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and Israel, it was obviously clear to me and to others that militarily, of course, we were overwhelmed. But at the same time, what became also clear is that we were overwhelmed diplomatically, we were overwhelmed politically, and we were overwhelmed in the public relations sphere. So a few of us got together. Lobbying and PR as well happens to be something I have a lot of experience in, and realized that we had fallen behind. We and I say collectively, and I also include myself. I mean, for years, I had continued to be involved in the political sphere in a variety of other ways. I'm an elected official here in Orange County, and what became clear is that the Turkish and Azeri lobbying largesse, if you will, the Turkish governments and the Azerbaijani lobbyists for years, over 20 years, had hired well-connected, politically connected lobbyists in DC to do really three things. One, to disparage Armenia. Two, to assert that Armenia is the aggressor and Armenians are the aggressors in Nagorno-Karabakh. And three, to burnish their image in the minds of Washington decision makers, so much so that they were able to make themselves appear to be more valuable than they really are. And that converted itself into policies that actually benefited Azerbaijan to the detriment of Armenia. So when we looked at the playing field, you had these two entities, these two governments hiring these very well-connected, very well-established lobbying firms, and we were not bringing in essence, we're not bringing our best team to the game. And so what we decided to do with Global Arm is take a little bit of different take, in that this is for the first time ever, I believe, in the history of Armenian American advocacy, we've made a significant investment into hiring professional lobbying groups who happen to be non-Armenian. That's not the only reason why we hired them. We hired them because they're good, they're connected, and and we can go into more details about those firms. But they're close to the Democrats, they're close to the Republicans. So we had to fight back. Unfortunately, as you know, Sona, lots of blood has been spilled. Lands have been surrendered of incalculable value. And then today, of course, we know that not only the loss and genocide that happened in Artsakh, but also the impending further attacks on Hayastan itself, of which Azerbaijan currently occupies nearly 200 square kilometers. So we had to find a way to push back, and we felt like GlobalArm, this was an answer to what those other lobbying efforts by Turkey and Azerbaijan. And by the way, it's not just Turkey and Azerbaijan and their lobbyists. They also had their allied groups, the oil and gas companies, the think tanks, that what I'd call caviar diplomacy, which is essentially using their money to wine and dine elected officials, scholars, think tanks, media, to go to Baku and show them what a paradise it is and what a so-called tolerant society it is in Baku, while at the same time they're massacring and beheading Armenians. And so that's the narrative that was being told by the regime in Baku, and it's time to fight back and use some of the tactics that they're doing in that hiring top flight professionals, but only in this case, we're not supervised by governments, but supervised by us, the Armenian diaspora.
We met at an event where you were asked, why not join forces with the ANCA or with other existing organizations such as the Armenian Assembly of America? And I thought your answer was interesting. I would like for you to share.
I don't remember my answer, but I'll let me just say this. So I used to work for the Armenian Assembly for many years. In the 1990s, I was their chief lobbyist. During that period of time, it was a different period of time. The Artsakh, the Armenians, had just won the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it was a time when in Washington, we really had an advantage in terms of the things that we were doing legislatively. I mean, aid to Armenia had soared to record levels. We fended off multiple efforts by Azerbaijan to repeal the sanctions against them through Section 907. During my tenure year at the Armenian Assembly, they never were able to repeal those sanctions. And I can tell you dozens and dozens and dozens of times they tried, and every time they tried, we repelled them. And then we also passed legislation back in the 90s that actually sanctioned Turkey, because at the time they were blockading, and they still blockade 30 years later. Not much has changed. They're still blockading Armenia. They were blocking humanitarian assistance to Armenia. So we were able to pass legislation authored by Senator Bob Dole and a bipartisan legislation, Ted Kennedy, Bob Dole, some of the old timers remember Jesse Helms, Paul Simon, all these giants of the Senate came and supported this bill, which said that any country that blocks humanitarian aid to another country should not be the recipient of U.S. assistance. And we were able to succeed in getting that passed unanimously in the Senate. So today, I think that your original question was about why don't we join forces? I think that we're very supportive of every effort that advances and strengthens the U.S.-Armenia relationship and that holds Azerbaijan accountable. We felt like there was an opportunity to create a model a little different than those other two models, principally bringing in these two lobbying firms under our supervision, which is very different. And that I don't feel that our efforts in any way compete with other two efforts. And in fact, I think there's complementary efforts. And if you look at, for example, the Jewish American community, for example, regardless of what you think of Israel or Palestine or Gaza, just looking at the Jewish American lobbying and political efforts, there are literally dozens of Jewish American organizations that are involved in either lobbying, political giving, taking delegations to Israel. Literally every week, there is a different delegation to Armenia. I mean, sorry, to Israel. I wish it was every week to Armenia, every week to Israel. And Sona, they're not just taking members of Congress. They're taking staff of congressional staff. They're taking state legislators. They're taking governors. They're taking city council members. They're taking mayors. They're taking county supervisors. They're taking scholars from think tanks. And so my point is that we're nowhere near, even with GlobalArm, and I think we're advancing the ball a lot, we still can get a lot stronger. So I think with our group, I think it's been additive to what is already going on. And so in that context, we certainly welcome, and we will get into that, we welcome supporters. We are a new group. We've been fortunate to raise some funding to be able to hire these lobbying firms to support us, and we're making great progress so far. But that's my answer to the question. And I think those other two groups do some other really great things. But I think we found a space as well to advance this agenda of strengthening U.S. security, U.S.-Armenia security relations, U.S.-Armenia economic relations, and then going in methodically and dealing with the issue of holding Aliyev and his regime accountable for what they have done and continue to do against Artsakh and also sovereign Armenia.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that in a little too. The big news with CFTJ this week. So we'll get to that. But before that, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about these different organizations. First of all, I think it's good to have multiple organizations, as one of the attorneys that day pointed out also, that it creates a healthy competition. Even if it is competitive, it's a good thing, because then it kind of forces everyone to be on their A game. So I think, first of all, that's a good thing. And then I'm trying to understand, so then if we were doing well after the war, at what point did we fall off? Like when you were working with Armenian Assembly of America and you said that we were doing well, at what point did things go wrong, or like why did you stop working with them?
Yeah, well, I went off to, I actually ended up moving to Hayastan with my wife in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with our young daughter at the time. So it went off in a little different direction. And then it's not, of course, it's not all about me. I think, and I admit, and I was thought about saying this going into this conversation with you today. I admit for years, although I was involved in political activities and lobbying in Washington, in various state capitals, in Sacramento, actually in Ottawa, in Canada, I did some lobbying there with some organizations I've involved with, that in terms of the Armenian advocacy and Armenian lobbying work, my activities tapered off. There's no question about that. And do I think it was right? No, I wish I hadn't. But at the same time, I think what happened over the last 20 years or so, Sona, is a sense of complacency. And I think when you have, one side was clearly on a mission of revenge, and then you've seen that in the atrocities that they've committed, the war crimes, the beheadings, the torture, the mistreatment of POWs, the ridicule, the boasting, the grotesque trophy park that Aliyev erected in Baku. And so they were on a mission on this narrative, and the lobbyists, of course, were working for Baku and for Turkey as well. We're not going to let them off the hook in this effort. So I think there was another side on a mission to tell this narrative and this story, and to lobby and to change the direction in the media as well. And I think when I say our side, I mean, collectively the Armenian diaspora, the Armenian governments, quite frankly, clearly have some blame in terms of falling behind. And so I think that's what happened. I think there was a sense of complacency. I know that I visited Artsakh in 2019. I'm thankful I got to go there. And it was an uneasy feeling. I didn't, just intuitively the time I had felt like it didn't feel like we were in the position that we should be. The legal status of Artsakh was not yet determined. And then, of course, then we started to hearing, we knew in 2016, Azerbaijan launched a major attack, which was the basis for Aliyev has said publicly, that served as our template for going in and doing the ethnic cleansing in 2020 and then finalizing it in 2023. So it seemed that we had just gotten behind, gotten a little complacent, not and forgot that this is a competition of ideas, and it's a competition of energy and of innovation, and so it all has to come together. And I'm going to say, we're not going to save Armenia. What we're doing at GlobalArm, what we're trying to do, advance and make progress and have measurable goals. I mean, that's what we're trying to do here. And I think we should be, we should be measured, even though we just started really this past year. We should be measured for what we do as well, and we should be graded on that.
So have none of the Armenian governments hired PR firms or lobbying firms themselves at any point?
So my understanding is that the Armenian government does not have their own lobbyists. I think they did at one point hire former Senator Dole for a very brief period of time, like a couple weeks or something like that. So the Armenian government, unlike the Azeri government and the Turkish government, they don't retain their own lobbyists. I can't say about public relations firms. My understanding is that the government does not have a public relations firm on retainer. There could be at some level of the Armenian government where they have, hired or retained a PR firm. But in terms of like influencing policy, because it's PR and influencing policy is different from corporate PR, entertainment PR. It's a different process, different reporters. My understanding is they have not hired a PR firm, to do that kind of work.
So can the current government either help or even sabotage what you're doing in any way now?
So you're asking really tough questions, which is good. So let me say that what we've tried to create here at GlobalArm is a product and organization that cascades whoever is in government. So, and as I said earlier, we're not connected to in any way the current government or any opposition political party in any way whatsoever. That's not to say we don't have conversations with the government, with opposition, with think tanks, with those who are called civil society in Armenia. And to your direct question, so our agenda, we believe is the right agenda, especially given that the complete betrayal of Russia in calling the Russian security forces and Artsakh peacekeepers is frankly insulting. They were not peacekeepers. They enabled the genocide in Artsakh. They stepped aside as Azeri military attacks escalated on civilians and civilian infrastructure. They allowed the Azerbaijanis to blockade the Hakkari Bridge, which cut off Nagorno-Karabakh, from Armenia. So I feel like I just feel like we're in a position now with our agenda that is going to can transcend whoever is in Yerevan. Are there things, I mean, I'm human, right? Are there things that the Armenian government does that I dislike immensely? Of course. Do they make a lot of mistakes? They sure do. Um, and so our mission is, how do we bring the U.S. and Armenia closer together and do it in ways that, regardless of who's in power, unless there's you know, a dictatorship along lines of Ilham Aliyev, we're gonna do what we can in terms of our lobbying work to bring these two countries, these two economies, together. I mean, my view, I mean, and I think a lot of people in the diaspora believe that the way to go is not the way to go of Ilham Aliyev and Alexander Lukashenko, which is a totalitarian regime with no human rights protections, no freedom of press, no freedom of assembly, opposition, every single opposition party in jail. That's not the direction I think we want to go in. So we have now a product that is, there's no question that Armenia is pivoting away from its dependence on Russia. And there's no question that of the other countries in the Caucasus region, that Armenia is moving in the direction of a democracy that is respectful of human rights. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. There are things that the government does that I don't agree with, that as someone who believes in the First Amendment here in the United States, which is near and dear to me, that I don't agree with. But in general, Armenia is moving in a direction towards democracy. Whereas you look at the latest, the Freedom House is this respected U.S. Washington-based nonprofit that ranks freedom indexes around the world. Okay, so now so they just came out with their report. Azerbaijan is now at one of the lowest ranking freedom indexes in the entire world. And because of what they did in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh itself has fallen the furthest in terms of freedom in the whole world, because now it's completely emptied and it's run by this genocidal dictator. Azerbaijan, in terms of freedom, they're below Belarus. Okay, I mean, it's really hard to get below Alexander Lukashenko. I mean, there's the the gangster himself, and then they're below China and Yemen and Iran and Cuba and even Russia. So I think what we're doing is moving in the construct of our objectives will outlast this administration and any administration that comes forward. I think this model is the right model. It doesn't mean at some point it might change down the road, but I think, to your long-winded answer to your question, is that what the government does certainly has an impact. But I think the way we've built GlobalArm, we're going to be around for a long period of time with this agenda, and I think it's going to work.
So you're going back and forth from LA to DC every couple of weeks?
So here, yes. Well, not so. We have full-time lobbyists there who are under kind of my day-to-day direction. So they're there every day, working in the halls of Congress, the administration, the White House, State Department, Pentagon. So they're working these issues every moment, meeting with think tanks, other allied partners. So I am going to Washington around, I would say, every 2 months. I am there and usually spend a week. But even when I'm not there, I think just today, I think I've spoken to them 5 times today. We had our, weekly call. We've got a lot of things planned. And so that's the beauty of having, professional lobbyists that are connected. And I think they're passionate about the issue. And you and me, I mean, I get emotional. You can tell. You get emotional. I try to keep those. It's hard. I try to keep those emotions in check. And the good thing about these lobbyists is they care, but they also know they have to be professional. And we have to find a way to succeed and find a way to win.
Tim, so tell us about some of the accomplishments so far.
Well, we just started. But there are a couple things that really stand out. So, if you might recall, last August, the former founding prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, came out and said that what Azerbaijan is doing with the blockade constitutes genocide under the convention, under Article 2C of the Genocide Convention. I was able to get in touch with Mr. Ocampo after he drew his own conclusions that genocide was occurring, and I was able to meet with him, and we both agreed that this message needs to be carried to Washington. So I spent some time with him. We then flew to Washington together and held many briefings in the House and the Senate, private briefings with staff and with members of Congress. And that resulted in 3 hearings that occurred on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh, with Mr. Ocampo as the key witness at the first hearing in the House of Representatives in the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in September of 2023. And I can tell you that that moment was very defining, in that I think the narrative was starting to change. We were starting to change the narrative a little bit, that for, this narrative that the Azeris and Turks had framed for 20 years, that Armenians are the aggressors, Armenians are the occupiers, it's Armenia that's the problem. And then Ocampo comes out with this report that says, wait a minute, no. These guys are committing genocide. And so we went to Washington, and it completely changed the narrative. I think that there's almost no one in Washington now, except for maybe the paid lobbyists for Azerbaijan and maybe a couple of the oil company lobbyists and a few think tank folks that are paid for by the Aliyev regime. No one believes this preposterous narrative anymore, that Armenia is the aggressor. And I think that was a defining moment for us as GlobalArm. And I think it demonstrated to a lot of congressional staff and members, maybe a couple of whom were still reluctant, that we're serious. It was a serious presentation. We had briefings before the entire Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in the House. And so I think that was one of the key accomplishments so far, that we were able to do that. And so, and then since that point, a lot of the work we've done so far, we're starting to report a little. I'm trying to have a little bit of a social media presence. I think it's something you and I have talked about. I do think it's important not to give away the playbook, because we have a lot of enemies that watch what we do. But I can tell you that since we brought these 2 groups on board, since November of 2023, it hasn't been that long, we're getting tremendous access to some very important decision makers on Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle, and at the State Department, and in the Pentagon, and in the NSC. And so we're growing as a respected voice. We've started to distribute on a weekly basis a kind of a compendium of policy developments in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. And I've gotten tremendous feedback from people in Washington who really like the reporting, if you will, that we're providing on what's going on. I've gotten some really good testimonials from people. Thank you for what you're doing. You're really filling a void that's been missing there. And we've also made some significant inroads into the Republican Party. So, and I say that because when we started GlobalArm and actively started to do this lobbying, it became apparent that for whatever reason, the Armenian issue, if you will, to boil it down, Armenian issue in Washington had tended to become more of a Democratic issue than a Republican issue. And we saw that some Republicans were reluctant to join in support of, issues that were really important to Armenia and Artsakh, because there were too many Democrats on the bill. And I can tell you, we have made a point of making, significant inroads into many Republicans. Senator Cassidy from Louisiana in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, an oil and gas state who's now become a very important ally of human rights issues and strengthening U.S.-Armenian relations. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is another example of some of the work we're doing. Senator Ricketts from Nebraska, all Republicans. So it's a very tightly coordinated, purposeful strategy that we look at every week, and how do our goals align with the meetings, and what's our messaging. And we've created new messaging that talks about all the things I'm talking about, but puts it in a way that is relatable to people in all segments of Washington, D.C.
A lot of the reports that human rights organization Center for Truth and Justice generates gets used by you and your lobbying firm to help with your lobbying efforts, whether it's in regards to the POWs or any ongoing human rights violations. And there was big news with CFTJ just this week that they submitted evidence to the International Criminal Court Thursday, requesting a formal investigation to Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev and other top leaders for genocide against Armenians. So they submitted a dossier of evidence containing testimony of more than 500 victims and witnesses. We're seeing a lot of press about this, the Washington Post, ABC News, and so on. CFTJ leader Ghazi Abkaria told the AP these atrocities are captured on social media by Azerbaijani soldiers themselves, where you hear them laughing, making comments, and taking the dead bodies that they've just slaughtered and beheaded. What does this mean for us politically?
Well, before I get to that, I want to say that GlobalArm and CFTJ, the Center for Truth and Justice, formed around the same time. They're a new organization. They formed perhaps a little bit before us, and then we formed as an organization. And I was able to participate in their first two international human rights conferences in Yerevan, and actually served as a moderator on the panel interviewing Michael Rubin, who's a respected scholar on policies in the Caucasus, Iran, and frankly, around the world. The work they've done, and God, I wish we didn't have to do this work, Sona. The work they've done actually documenting and verifying and getting eyewitness or witness testimony to these atrocities initiated by Ilham Aliyev. The work that they've done has been absolutely amazing. It's gut-wrenching. And to do this in the short period of time that they did, as the ethnic cleansing in 2020 was taking place, and as there was the first forced deportations during 2020, and then some of them were able to go back. One of the first things CFTJ, and it wasn't even CFTJ then, they were just starting to form, saying you've got to keep the evidence. Keep the evidence. And so one of the things that what they've done, which both on the political front and the legal front, that has been helpful, is Aliyev himself is the star witness in the genocide. He himself creates a culture of hate, Armenophobia. He boasts about his so-called conquest militarily, the atrocities that they're occurring, the glorification on social media. So he himself has been exhibit number one, and CFTJ has very skillfully taken Aliyev's words and used them for purposes of getting justice for Artsakh and justice for sovereign Armenia, of which he occupies currently 200 square kilometers. So what that's done politically is that this veneer of Aliyev tried to create for 20 years of a welcoming, independent, oil-producing country that is the alternative to Russia and to other oil sources, and that can be the savior for Europe to get oil and gas. I mean, that's already blown the CFTJ work has gone a long way in completely blowing that out of the water, because now it's very clear. It's been to us, but not to a lot of decision makers, and not to the media, and not to parliamentarians in Europe and think tanks and members of Congress. What CFTJ has done politically has shown through evidence, not through conjecture, not through emotional social media posts. Guilty, I've done that myself. How could we not, witnessing what we started to see in 2020? We were all angry. We were all upset. We saw the betrayal. We saw the betrayal of Russia. But what CFTJ has done is injected a sense of professionalism and painstaking detail of taking witness testimony properly on the torture, on the abuse, on the atrocities, on the war crimes, and yes, on the genocide. So in that context, by being the professional organization they've had, being this serious group that's pulled together human rights and legal experts from around the world, they've brought attention to this issue in a very substantive and serious way. And as a result, that's moved the political world as well. So so what we've been able to do, because I sometimes refer to them as our sister organization. They're not a lobbying organization per se, but a lot of the educational materials and that they've been producing on reports of hate and violence and aggression and war crimes and torture and the mistreatment of the POWs, we have been taking that information and providing it to decision makers throughout Washington, D.C. And it's starting, at 3 years and 4 years of doing this, it's starting now to have an impact. And we'll see. I have to tell you that the State Department, which has made lots of mistakes, no question about that, what they have done or not done to prevent the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Nagorno-Karabakh, they hold some responsibility for that. There's no question about that. But I think also there is an opportunity now, especially with what CFTJ has filed with the ICC, to it now gives the State Department another opportunity to start to tell more of the truth of what's happened and tell it in plain language and tell it directly. There's a human rights report coming out imminently, probably in the next couple of weeks, on Azerbaijan, and it's going to be published by the State Department. And so we all need to take a close look at that and see that if what's in that report holds true to what the reality is. And when the reality is that we've got a gangster state in Baku that's unhinged and that is aligned with Vladimir Putin, and aligned with Vladimir Putin in order to undermine Armenia and its sovereignty, so that Armenia itself doesn't exist. And that's a factor now that has finally, I think, awakened Washington and the European Union to now decouple. I don't want to be too policy wonkish, but for 20 years, the 20 years I talked about prior in Washington, they considered Armenia and Azerbaijan kind of one entity. Like, we have to treat them the same, because it's like, and the other thing they said was that we can't provide security assistance in a way that gives one side an advantage over another. Well, that's clearly now gone, because one side no doubt has the military advantage. And that too, I think because of Armenia's pivot to the West and desire to lessen dependence on Russia, and be closer to the EU, and perhaps we move at some point down to a closer EU relationship, whether it's an EU membership or some transitional status. All these things are, extremely relevant, extremely important. So CFTJ and its role is, I mean, they've earned respect around the world. And so for us to be able to kind of repackage a lot of the evidence and that they've documented and provide that to policymakers. And we've done that again yesterday with their filing to the ICC, which which just came out. And we're already hearing lots of responses from Washington on that. So I know at the end of the day, if I were listening to this, okay, that's great. We need results. And I couldn't agree more. We need to have results. We need to show that uh, this effort that we've initiated GlobalArm does what we say we're going to do, which is increase security assistance to Armenia, increase economic cooperation, not really between governments, but commercially. We know that the IT sector is probably the shining star of Armenia's economy, and there are American companies that have invested and do business and hire Armenian employees. But there's more we can do on the economic front, which is a huge priority for us. We're already planning a trade mission to Armenia sometime, hopefully in the fall, if not in the fall, early in 2025.
In general, there's a lot of talk about Armenians being divided and that Armenians need to be more united or that Armenians are apathetic. And I always argue, I don't think that Armenians are apathetic at all. It's just that we have come to a point where it's really demoralizing. It's hard to know who to trust, what to trust, because Armenians were very united during the revolution and then promises weren't met. They were disappointed. They felt lied to. And
Yeah,
then they were united again during the 2020 war.
right.
And some families gave their life savings to Armenia Fund. And then
And some gave their life.
literally, yeah, and their lives. And then a lot of the donations and financial and even just people were buying boots and
Yeah,
goggles, medications that, and it never,
guilty. Same
all
thing.
of us,
Yeah,
yeah. And then we know that they never actually got it. And so you feel lied to over and over again. So
right.
for me, CFTJ was one of these organizations where I was at a point where I just really didn't trust or believe anyone. And then I just see this actual results.
Right.
You see that suddenly there
Of
are
course.
different articles coming out and public opinion is
Yep.
changed because of the articles that they're putting out. Finally, we had the right narrative, because one of the most frustrating things for me personally was when we would have people representing Armenia, whether they were journalists or politicians, and they would use the wrong terminology. And in the
Well,
terminology so important in legal.
they still use the wrong terminology, and that's
Yeah.
why we haven't talked a lot about it, but over the since we formed GlobalArm, we also have been very involved in some PR efforts, um, and a couple of them that have occurred over the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the things that we constantly need to do, because the Azeris and the Turks have been so aggressive and so active on using terms that are deceiving and also that are harmful to Armenians and Artsakh Armenians. I'll give you an example. Karabakh. Aliyev likes to call it Karabakh. Well, no, that's not correct. And some journalists have actually started to use that term. In fact, even in the Washington Post article that came out today on the CFTJ filing said Karabakh. And I already have tried to make some movement to correct that. So it's either Nagorno-Karabakh or it's Artsakh, and I believe those are the two terms that are appropriate and that should be used. Artsakh has never been part of an independent Azerbaijan, which just became independent, in 1922. It's never been part of Azerbaijan. Um, so I mean, there are things like that continue to occur, but just not to belabor the earlier point, but imagine for 20 years this narrative of Armenian aggression, the so-called Armenian aggression, Armenian occupation, Armenian territorial conquest, this idea of separatists. That's another word that's used constantly. They're separatists. Yeah. Um, no, they're freedom fighters. They are tired of being massacred. They are tired of being subjugated as third-class citizens. They're tired of their culture being desecrated and erased, and they want to live independently without this fear. And so these terms that are used by journalists in particular, and even some, politicians, members of Congress, other policymakers around the world are incorrect. And so what that requires, Sona, I mean, it's a daily, hourly effort that takes place. And what we're doing here at GlobalArm, it's a piece of that, but we need, we not only need the lobbying, we need the public relations, we need the education. And I wanted to get to your point about, during the war, the 2020 war, like you, like myself, everyone else, everyone did everything they could, whether it's giving to the Armenia Fund, whether it's sending night goggles, whether it was, vests for the Armenian soldiers. I mean, anything we could possibly send, we tried to send. Now, I happen to be involved in leading this group called GlobalArm. And here's what I was asked this question the other day, what can the diaspora do? So, and I say this, there's so much talent in the diaspora. I happen to have experience in lobbying and PR, and political work. And I've also worked on Armenian legislative stuff and non-Armenian legislative stuff. This is a role that's natural for me, and I feel like I can have an impact. But there are people involved in the arts, in sciences, in information technology, in law, like CFTJ. And if you are, then, maybe you want to start your own initiative or look at joining another initiative. And this is, I guess, my pitch. I mean, we'd love for people to join with us in our mission on GlobalArm. But if this is not your cup of tea, then do something that is related to what your strength is. And so let's talk about, well, the government won't accept us or not. I'm not concerned about that. I believe that the Hayastansis are accepting of the diaspora. I believe the ones that I've been able to work with since we started GlobalArm, and because I've been able to see the work of CFTJ firsthand in Yerevan, are very appreciative and accepting because we're partners. We don't tell them what to do. We have them part of this mission, and whatever the mission is. In our case, it's a lobbying effort. CFTJ's is documentation of atrocities. I know there's like Tumo School. There's all sorts of things that are happening. There are ideas that are emanating from the diaspora. So it's instead of, I'm not saying you shouldn't unleash yourself on social media. Sometimes that feels good. I know I've done it before, but I think a better approach is to find ways to use the talents and skills that you have right now to be part of something that you believe in. Or I'm not worried about creating something that's necessarily duplicative. If you're talented and you're skilled and your heart's in the right place, and that is to do what we need to do to make sure that this sovereign Armenian country that is still in existence, which is under this existential threat. All the things that we love about Hayastan and Artsakh, and they should have the right of return. That's going to be a challenging task, but we're never going to forget that. I believe that the diaspora becomes even more, I don't want to say divided, Sona, but even more scattered without a homeland like Armenia. And that homeland is under threat. And so that the accomplishments in IT that have taken place, the accomplishments in terms of some of the democracy that's occurred there, the accomplishments in hospitality, if you've been to Armenia, there, the Hayastansis are warm, caring, great people. Imagine that not being there anymore. It's already hard enough without Artsakh to be able to go to, then to also now have the possibility of Armenia fall into the hands of someone like Ilham Aliyev or Vladimir Putin, which is their goal. Make no mistake that this is about Aliyev and Putin colluding to allow for the ethnic cleansing of genocide of Artsakh, and also the betrayal of Armenia when September of 2022, when Azerbaijan launched those heinous attacks. And I did go to the sites that were Azerbaijani attacks, and it was mostly civilian infrastructure that they attacked. And so this is their goal. And I think we in the diaspora, regardless, we don't like a lot of the things the government does, but I think if we keep our heads straight, focused on concrete goals, we're going to see progress.
Tim, what's your position on Artsakh, and is it in the works to return Artsakh to its indigenous Armenians that have lived there and have always been a majority there for thousands of years? Is that something that's being talked about when you're in DC? I mean, is this a
I talk
possible?
about it all the time. So it's very much part of our agenda. I know I mentioned economic and security relations, but also the issue of, I mean, one of our founding principles, which is still on our website, is self-determination and self-rule for Artsakh. I wrote an op-ed um, a couple of years ago, published in Newsweek um, for the national interest. One of the two publications that I wrote, co-authored with Nerses Kopalian, who's a faculty member at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV. And he's one of GlobalArm's advisors. We wrote a policy paper on the legal case for independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, that in itself, the legal case for its independence is clear. And it's on our website, and we go through a series of historical events that document, well, one, that it's never been part of Azerbaijan ever, and that two, it lawfully seceded from the Soviet Union, and that it lawfully declared itself independent, and that it should be independent. So that has always been our view. Right now that Aliyev has committed this genocide and these ethnic cleansing, so now what we need to do is focus on things that are meaningful and need to happen. One, there needs to be consensus about the right of return. Artsakh Armenians have the right of return to their homes and properties. Okay, that's one. Two, once they have that right of return, of course they need security protections, like letting them. I mean, they're not going to go back under these conditions with Aliyev and the wolves waiting for them. I mean, and with no cameras in sight, we know what Aliyev does and Putin do even when there's sunshine, they still do it. I mean, so they can't go back without proper security measures. And then three, the other thing we are asking for is for a permanent monitoring presence from an independent body, whether it's the ICRC, whether it's the UN, whether it's the OSCE, to ensure that the personal property of the Armenians is not desecrated and damaged, and that the cultural heritage of Armenians, and we know that's already occurring, that desecration stops. And so that otherwise we're going to see Nakhichevan happened in Artsakh. What they did in Nakhichevan will now happen in Artsakh, where they erase traces of Armenianness throughout the entire territory. So those are the things that need to happen right now. And those are the things we are actively lobbying on in Washington, D.C. Now, there seems to be interest in doing all those three things, which is right of return, proper security measures for that return, and protecting of property, personal property, and cultural and religious heritage. Now we need to get to the next level and make it happen. So that is our view. I believe that most of the Artsakhs want to return to this is their land. This is your home is your home. Your land is your land. I mean, it's the first time in 2 millennia there's not an Armenian in Artsakh. I mean, if ever there was a classic and legal definition of genocide, it's right before us.
Then what could be the West's interests with Armenia? Are we strategically important for them?
Very much so. So just look at a map. Armenia's, centered at in the heart of the old Silk Road, at a key spot of, Southeastern Europe or Eurasia, whatever political geographic determination you want to consider. Armenia, of course, borders Iran and Turkey. A NATO member. I don't call them a NATO ally. They're not much of an ally, but it's a highly strategic location where Armenia is. And then you couple that with the desire of Armenia to pivot away from Russia and its dependence on Russia, and of course Russia, itself betrayed Armenia, betrayed Artsakh. The whole security architecture under Russia and CSTO doesn't exist. And then you have the other kind of institutional support. I mean, Armenians are more of a European facing people. Um, and so, and then other things. We have the second largest U.S. embassy complex in the world. That's in Armenia. Two, there was a recent poll done by Washington, D.C. based International Republican Institute. It's Republican, but they're not partisan Republican. I mean, you look at some of their polling results. They just came out with the poll. Approval rating of the United States in Armenia right now is almost 90%. The approval rate of France, not surprisingly, is 96%. The approval rate of the Europeans is 87%. And then you look at the approval rate of Russia. This is Russia, okay? Right? You think Hayastan, like longstanding cultural ties, 33% approval. So the Hayastansis have figured out, not surprisingly, what's going on. So if you're you know, a US policymaker and you see all these factors and then couple that with a dictator in Baku who's overplayed his hand on the value of his oil and gas supplies, which are less than 2% to go to Europe, his alliance with Putin on just about everything, his desire to kick the U.S. essentially out of the Caucasus, and has said that Aliyev has said he doesn't want the U.S. involved in any peace talks. He wants it facilitated by Putin. So all of these factors lead to Washington, I think late, but waking up to the fact that there's an opportunity here. And I'm not saying that Armenia is going to be, saved by the United States. I think we're seeing a diversification of partnerships that don't rely on a so-called ally, which completely betrayed Armenia. And shame on them for doing that. Shame on them. Because a lot of, I think, Hayastansis believe that Russia, at the end of the day, that the people that were called peacekeepers in Artsakh were going to play that role, and that obviously was not the case. And then in Armenia itself, this low grade NATO version called the CSTO, which is the security alliance with a few countries, is meaningless. And so I think that's where I think the U.S. is interested. And I can tell you, Sona, in our work with Plurus and McKeon, in our meetings in Capitol Hill and in administration right now, and there is a huge desire to take this relationship to the next level. And I know people are probably thinking that are following this, well, they haven't given much money so far for the refugees. The level of assistance to Armenia is not where it should be. And I completely agree. And that's what we're working on right now. And by the end of the year, I think we'll see some results. I mean, offering, $11.5 million for ethnic cleansing of 120,000 people, as Samantha Power, head of USAID, offered, that's not acceptable. So I think we're starting to make some movement, and hopefully we'll see some results soon.
So we touched on bipartisan support being important for us. How about the upcoming presidential elections? How do you see the elections affecting us and everything that we're working toward?
The U.S. presidential elections are highly consequential. The fact of the matter is that the United States and the European Union are truly the key entities involved right now that can deter this extraterritorial aggression sought by Ilham Aliyev. So the fact that that whoever is in power right now, it's Joe Biden and his administration, or whether it's Donald Trump, it's highly consequential. I will say that there's equal concern probably under both scenarios. President Biden happens to be the one that's in power right now, and that's why we at GlobalArm are doing our part to work with this administration, as well as Republicans on Capitol Hill and Democrats. But at the same time, we're also doing outreach to the Trump campaign, because it's something we have to do. I mean, there's some warning signs. I mean, on the eve of the Artsakh war in 2019, Azerbaijan got $100 million in security assistance from the Trump administration. And we know that even in testimony that before the Foreign Relations Committee when they were asked about, well, didn't that security assistance allow Azerbaijan to then put other uh, materiel and offensive military forces in place because they got this money from the U.S. Now that freed up opportunities to offensively attack Artsakh. And I think that was the case. And when you saw State Department officials asked about that, they really couldn't answer the question. So that was a real alarm bell. When that happened in 2019, $100 million in security assistance, and in the waning days of the Trump administration, that obviously was a serious problem. So I think the elections are going to be, they're going to be tight. I think Armenians will play a role in the states that we know where there's, an Armenian population that's measurable, that can have an impact, that kind of size that can have an impact in election. In a close election like this, it doesn't have to be a big population. I mean, that's there's obvious states that are in contest that are, considered, states that are up for grabs, and that's, Wisconsin and Michigan and Nevada and Arizona, are all like, and Pennsylvania also. I mean, these are states where there are sizable Armenian American populations. And then, but this election, I mean, it's enormous, Sona. I mean, not because of as I said, the U.S. and the EU right now are the two entities that are able to deter this relentless aggression from Ilham Aliyev and Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin. They're not going to save Armenia, but it helped diversify the security and economic strategy.
Tim, so CFTJ's filing with the International Criminal Court, if the prosecutor just so happens to have a bias, with the abundance of evidence that's been presented, can the prosecutor actually exercise a bias? And if so, then is there a way to appeal?
I don't know if there was a way to appeal. That's a good question. Not sure about an appellate route. If so the process, what I do know is that right now that the CFTJ filing is to encourage the prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor, to conduct a preliminary investigation. And so that's where the process currently stands. If at some point this prosecutor, Khan, decides that he does not believe there is enough evidence to merit an investigation in terms of a formal appellate route, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to get CFTJ on here. I'll come back to you and let you know. I don't believe there is a formal appeal if the prosecutor decides not to pursue an investigation.
Yeah, because as far as I understood, it's discretionary.
Right.
But in any case, why is it still a big deal? With however which way it goes, why is it still a big deal that this filing happened?
Well, it's a huge deal. I mean, it's the first filing since Armenia ratified the Rome Statute. I mean, it's not filing. I'm sorry. I need to get my turn. It's the first request to open a preliminary investigation against Azerbaijan since Armenia ratified the Rome Statute. It's historic. I mean, it's very significant. It's politically important. More importantly, it's legally important because it moves us a small step closer to justice, hoping that the prosecutor, as you said, does move forward and conducts a formal investigation of war crimes, atrocities, genocide, the things that crimes of aggression. So I know there are four things that the prosecutor can look at, and there's no one who fits that squarely more than Ilham Aliyev. I mean, they look at genocide, they look at war crimes, they look at crimes of aggression, and they look at crimes against humanity. All of the things that we know through CFTJ's witness testimony, documentary evidence that we know that they've done to civilians, servicemen, POWs. We all saw with, with horror, the extrajudicial murders of defenseless Armenian servicemen during the 2022 invasion. And so we know what they're capable of. And now to turn this into, I would think that the prosecutor will move forward because the evidence is overwhelming.
Mhm.
The evidence is overwhelming, not just on Artsakh and what happened there with the ethnic cleansing and the forced deportations and the genocide, but what they're doing and have done in the sovereign territory of Armenia. So I think Ilham Aliyev is on a path for isolation. I think that the path that he has chosen to align himself with Vladimir Putin, to align himself with a pattern of war crimes and aggression and unlawful detention of POWs and sham trials and overplaying his hand on the value of oil and gas and his freedom ranking and jailing his own citizens and journalists. Ilham Aliyev, I'm hopeful, will be banished to the dustbin of dictators we no longer have to deal with very soon because he's on that path.
How much do we spend on lobbying efforts versus Azerbaijan?
Much less. Azerbaijan, I mean, that's the simple answer. Azerbaijan spends tens of millions of dollars on their lobbying. Our efforts don't come close to those lobbying efforts, which is why I go back to GlobalArm and why we formed it. Because we need to take, and they hire these professional lobbying firms to do this dirty work for them, what I say blood money. And we're such a great country. We allow these grotesque dictatorships and rogue regimes to come to our country here and hire these lobbyists and tell these lies and untruths to our elected officials. But we allow it. I mean, you couldn't do this in Baku. You couldn't do it in Belarus. You couldn't do it in Moscow. So they're spending tens of millions of dollars, Sona. And I can tell you that we are right now at a fraction of that, which is why we're on a mission to take this, GlobalArm to the next level and not only fund it with these two firms for the long term, and I consider the long term at least for 3 years, so we can have a runway of to get success, but also to turn this into a possible model to have a GlobalArm presence across the world, because obviously the U.S. is important to us, and I think the key actor, but there are other places where we could use a presence: the Middle East, South Asia, obviously Europe, what we've seen in France, and so those are places where we could augment and enhance our advocacy and our political work so that we have this interconnected alliance. Our goals will be similar, but each country had, a different parliament, different Congress, different types of processes where policy and security decisions and economic decisions are made. And if we had this global alliance, I think you'll see that that when in times of crisis like what happened in 2020, there was no one there to come to Armenia's defense. We never want that to happen again.
Tim, so what do you need from us? How can people help you do your job? If they believe in what you're doing, how can they contribute?
Well, if what you heard, I mean, if you believe in our mission, if you believe in what we're doing, we've been able to raise some funding so far that's allowed us to hire these two lobbying firms. We are certainly looking for more support. We welcome support. If you think what we're doing aligns with you, we do have a website, globalarm.org. And a lot of, our missions there, our values, there is a way to donate online, but I understand that, maybe that's not the way you want to do it. And I'm happy to be in touch with me, to talk further about the mission of GlobalArm and how you can contribute. So we are looking for funders. There's no question. We have what we call a deck that we prepared, which shows what we've done so far, where we're going, how much money we're seeking, and happy to circulate that as well. And if we welcome support, we need it. we're a fresh voice. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen in Washington so far. We are considered a fresh voice, a fresh face. Well, maybe not so much mine, but our little bit. I'm kidding. Our but our lobbying team are young and dynamic and connected. And so we need our Armenian Americans from around the country to come join with us. And I think you'll see results. Go to our website, globalarm.org. You can contact us at info@globalarm.org. You can try to follow us. We just started social media presence on Instagram and LinkedIn, so you can start to follow what we're doing. But we need financial support, no question. And so if you agree with the direction we're going in, we're happy to talk to you.
So the financial support is specifically to retain lobbying firms?
Yeah, I'm volunteer. I'm a volunteer. Greg Kavajian, who's our treasurer, part of the group, he's a volunteer. We have a number of advisory board members who are on our website, and that advisory board is growing. No one is paid. All of the money is going towards our direct lobbying efforts. And also with the GlobalArm Foundation, those monies go towards taking these delegations, congressional delegations and delegations of influencers over to Hayastan.
Mm-hmm. Tim, and finally, what's the status with our POWs? What's being said behind the scenes in these meetings?
Well, one, we don't know everything that's said because there's a black box in Baku. We know that there's as many as close to 100 prisoners and hostages, somewhere between 23 and 60 probably, but we just don't know because we're dealing with a regime that doesn't tell the truth. And so we have been putting tremendous pressure on the US government, not just Congress, but the administration that, you know, I know they want a peace deal, but in advance of that peace, any peace deal, if there is one, the POWs and hostages need to be released immediately and unconditionally. I think I just saw today that Ruben Vartanian is now decided to go on a hunger strike. And that's a tactic that's used. I mean, I'm not the hunger strike, and I understand why he's doing it because he's being detained unlawfully without due process and would be subject to a sham trial. Now he's not allowed to communicate with his family. And it's not just him. I mean, that's a common practice of genocide perpetrators to go after those leaders who were part of self-government. Of course, they did it in the Ottoman Turkish Empire. They've done it in other genocides that have occurred. You go after what they consider the leadership and try to cut the heart out, but they're not going to be able to, because there's always going to be an Artsakh movement. That is Armenian land. It always will be. But I think the U.S. can do more on getting these POWs released. And I think this is where the media comes in as well. We have to keep the issue of these detainees alive in the media, in op-eds, in think tanks. I mean, that's something we have to keep doing because we cannot forget that they're there because that's what the Aliyev regime wants. They want everyone to go away. They want the US to get out, EU to get out, let Putin and Aliyev handle everything. And so to the extent we continue to internationalize the issue of the POWs, and I think there's some new legislation that's going to come out we're working on that's going to, again, call for the unconditional release of POWs, additional sanctions. There's a lot more that can be done. I don't know. I don't think Ilham Aliyev has yet given up on his image. I still think he wants to be considered a great leader in his mind and a leader of a small but relevant country worldwide. I think he still believes that. And so I think that though that our pressure on the international community to get these POWs and prisoners released and to continue to do that and to tie their detention to Ilham Aliyev's policies. I mean, every day that this occurs is every day that he will, as I said, he's going to go down in history as one of the most notorious and horrible, uh, dictators that has lived in our lifetime. So I think that we continue to have to elevate this issue, not just in our lobbying work, but in our PR work and our social media, and keep this issue alive.
Tim, thank you so much for all of the insight. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Sona, you're amazing. Thank you for having me. I it's such a pleasure to get to know you, and really enjoyed our conversation today.
There's still so many things I want to talk to you about.
Why
So
can't we come back? I mean, we're doing I didn't want to mention it. I could have, but maybe it'll be a good talking point. We're doing a briefing in Washington in a couple weeks, so I can come back and talk to you about it.